Don't be fooled by the biggest myth in startups.
Welcome to Business Tips and Stories, the podcast channel dedicated to helping you succeed in the world of business. Tune in to unlock the keys to success. Subscribe to our channel to stay updated and never miss any tips, stories, or business opportunities.
Don't be fooled by the biggest myth in startups. It's specifically designed to make founders doubt themselves. An entrepreneur I work with came to me nearly in tears because he was convinced he needed to shut down his startup. He was a year into building his company and had raised over $500,000. Despite his early traction, he was sure his company was going to fail, and he believed the right thing to do was return any remaining investor money before it was all gone. "Why are you so sure your company is going to fail?" I asked, trying to understand the problem. "We're not growing fast enough," he huffed. "Our burn rate is too high and our sales cycle is too slow." It's exactly like a case study I read in business school, except the company had raised 20x more capital than us and they were able to solve the problem with an expensive marketing campaign we could never afford. I laughed. "Did you just cite a case study?" I asked. "From business school. That's the reason you're certain your company is going to fail. I think you're okay to keep going, but I swear we studied this exact scenario," he countered. "I feel like I already know the outcome if we keep going in this direction." "You didn't study the exact scenario," I assured him. "That's the problem with case studies, they propagate the biggest myth in startups. The myth of the 30-minute startup. The biggest myth in startups is what I like to call the 30-minute startup. It's the idea that someone can learn the story of a successful startup in 30-ish minutes. To understand what I mean, consider any examples of founders sharing stories about how they built their successful startups. The stories take lots of different forms, including the aforementioned case study referenced by the founder I was talking with. They can also take the form of entrepreneurs talking about their startups on stage at tech conferences. Maybe it's a guest speaker in an entrepreneurship class. Or maybe it's a podcast episode or YouTube video or Netflix documentary. Whatever the case, the story of the startup itself, minus any introduction time or Q&A time, etc., usually gets conveyed in somewhere around 30 minutes. Think about that for a moment. The story of a successful startup gets told in 30-something minutes, but that startup's actual story didn't happen in 30 minutes. That startup story took years, which means the version being told in 30-ish minutes is only a tiny slice of what happened and is missing enormous amounts of detail. To help contextualize just how small of a fragment gets shared when successful founders publicly tell their startup stories, imagine the same ratio in the context of a TV show or movie. The 30 minutes of the story that makes it to the screen is pulled from a much larger amount of footage, which means the audience is only experiencing a minuscule percentage of what actually happened. Despite the enormous disparity between the actual story of a successful startup and the amount of story that usually gets told, audiences rarely seem to appreciate this nuance. They'll read, watch, or listen to a 30-minute version of a startup's success story and feel as though they completely understand what happened. This isn't a problem if a startup story is only being shared for entertainment, but that's rarely the case. Instead, the stories of successful startups get shared in order to teach founders important lessons about entrepreneurship. How to properly teach startups using stories. I should admit that I'm personally guilty of using founder stories to teach about entrepreneurship because I literally host a podcast where I interview some of the world's most successful tech founders and share their stories in, you guessed it, roughly 30 minutes. I'm confessing my own guilt because I want to reiterate the fact that 30-minute startup stories aren't inherently bad. The bad part is that they're never properly framed. By that I mean nobody ever starts their case studies or podcasts by saying, "What you're about to read or hear is a wildly imperfect summation of a significantly more complex series of events." Don't draw any definitive conclusions, just enjoy the story. If I'm being honest with myself, I should know better. People like me need to do a better job of reminding entrepreneurs listening to the startup stories we produce that successful startups don't take 30 minutes. Heck, they don't take 30 days, or even 30 months, because the average amount of time a successful startup takes to go from launch to IPO, which, itself, is only one way to measure startup success, is somewhere between 7 and 10 years. That's as much as 5,256,000 minutes. Lots of stuff happens in the other 5,255,970 minutes of a startup's existence that we don't hear about when we encounter a startup's 30-minute story. Knowing this, how can anyone possibly expect to make any reliable predictions about the future of their own companies based on a tiny fragment of another startup's extremely complicated story? Simply put, nobody can, and that's why nobody should try. Remember this the next time you encounter the story of how another startup founder successfully built and sold a business. None of what you hear about other startups is nearly as simple, quick, or straightforward as whatever you're being told. Enjoy learning about other startups, but be careful not to make any decisions for your own startup based on what you think might have happened to some other startup. There's always lots more context you don't know. In fact, the only thing you can know for sure is that no other startup's story is the same as yours. Want more lessons about startups and entrepreneurship? Take a FRE mini course with me right now.
Thanks for listening to Business Tips and Stories. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any tips, stories, or business opportunities. See you soon.